We are just one very endless week away from Election Day, folks. I'm out here in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where Donald Trump is holding a rally later tonight as questions swirl about whether his narrow path to the presidency is widening maybe just a bit. Both the GOP nominee and Hillary Clinton are making a final push for votes everywhere. Trump announced today that he is spending $25 million over the next few days on TV ads here in the Badger State and in other blue states, including Colorado, Virginia, Michigan, and New Mexico. Clinton's campaign, in turn, is making six-figure buys in each of those states, which not too long ago seemed safely in her column. Clinton's surrogates are also campaigning in some of those same states where Trump is now seemingly on a bit of offense, here in Wisconsin. Tim Kaine is appearing, Bill Clinton going to Colorado. Hillary Clinton today had some harsh words for her political opponent, and this explanation about why the race might get more negative before it's over. At a rally today, Clinton went back to her tried and true tactic of this campaign for her. She appeared on stage with the Miss Universe pageant winner, Alicia Machado, and brought up the subject of Trump and women.
Contestants say that Donald Trump came in to look at them when they were changing. Some of them were just 15 years old. We cannot hide from this. We've got to be willing to face it. This man wants to be president of the United States of America.
Today, a new ABC News Washington Post tracking poll, the data from that survey, has Trump now leading Clinton by 1% nationally. That's, of course, within the margin of error, but the symbolism of Trump being ahead after being well behind in that poll. And amid everybody wondering if the revived FBI probe into Clinton's email practices might be doing her some damage, her campaign says it raised $11.3 million online in the past 72 hours. So, John, 7 days left. Is there any real evidence that Trump is catching up?
Well, Mark, we are still suffering a little bit from a paucity of polling here that really, for the first time ever, it seems like we'd want to know what's going on more than ever right now, and we're still a little bit fumbling our way towards figuring out what the impact of the Comey letter has been. Look, there's the ABC Washington Post poll that's, has Trump ahead by 1 right now. Other than that, which everyone's hanging a lot on right now, if you look across all the other polling, there's no doubt that the race is tightening a little bit, but there's not a compelling case that it's tightening a lot so far.
I think the most compelling case would come from the Clinton side. They're going back on TV in some of these states. They're sending surrogates, as I said, Bill Clinton to Colorado, Tim Kaine here to Wisconsin. That doesn't mean they're panicking. It doesn't even mean that their numbers are showing a decline in her lead. It simply could mean they're being careful. Trump's going on offense in these places. Why not play defense? So I don't think we can jump to the conclusion that that's in any way decisively meaningful. But it does suggest, if they weren't the least bit worried, for instance, about Wisconsin or about Colorado or Michigan, they wouldn't be trying to buttress themselves there. They'd be focusing on winning North Carolina, say, and ending Trump's chances.
Well, one of the things that's true is that the Clinton campaign has amassed a really large stockpile of dollars over the course of the last 15, 16, 18 months. And we're now at the point where there's no point in holding on to that money. You might as well spend it if you have it. So I tend to think that, that they have always said the race was going to be tight. And if we're now in the last 7 days, again, don't leave a, as they say, don't leave a bullet in the chamber that you don't fire. When it comes to ads, that's what those things are. They're bullets. So why not get on the air?
You're totally right about the money. If they've got enough to flood the airways and saturate in the key battlegrounds, of course. It's those visits, though. Bill Clinton's time is very valuable. The fact that they're sending him to Colorado. Tim Kaine's time, very valuable. The fact that they're sending him to Wisconsin means, again, that they're at least keeping an eye on those states. And the Trump campaign today said in a conference call with the RNC, with the press this afternoon, that their path involves winning the big four of Florida, Ohio, Iowa, and North Carolina. But the reality is, if they lose North Carolina, we said yesterday, could break their back. Maybe they're going to find a replacement here in Wisconsin. Maybe. But she's still ahead.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And the other thing that's really clear is that we're not anymore talking about Georgia and Texas and the Democrats trying to expand the map. There's no question about that. All right. Today is November the 1st, which obviously means it's the first day of open enrollment for Obamacare. This comes just a week after news that some people will see shocking rate hikes, or at least substantial rate hikes. and fewer insurance options under the Affordable Care Act next year. A storyline that the Trump campaign considers to be something of a gift in this final stretch of the election. That delight was on full display today in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump and his running mate Mike Pence called for health care policy changes, including the end of individual mandates and the ability for Americans to shop for insurance plans across state lines.
Before it was called Obamacare, it was called Hillary Care. Even former President Bill Clinton said, costs are going up, coverage is going down, it's the craziest thing in the world. I guess even with the Clintons, sometimes truth happens. President Obama said, here's the quote, when one of these companies comes out with a new smartphone that has a few bugs, what do? They fix it. They upgrade it. Unless it catches fire, then they pull it off the market. Well, what a coincidence, Mr. President, because that's exactly what we're going to do with Obamacare. We're going to pull it off the market so it stops burning up our wallets.
The president said, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, which may go down as one of the great political lies of the century. She wants to put the government totally in charge of health care in America. If we don't repeal and replace Obamacare, we will destroy American health care forever. It's one of the single most important reasons why we must win on November 8th.
There has not been much polling about how news of these rate hikes is affecting the popularity of Obamacare. But Mark, is your view at this point that this is a sleeper issue that might make a real difference in this presidential race?
Well, that seems to certainly be the view of the Republicans. Of course, they have hammered on the Affordable Care Act since it passed. The polling, as you and I have discussed many times, it's more negative than positive about the law. It certainly energizes the Republican base. It unites all Republicans, really, almost every case. It unites a lot of independents who don't like it, particularly business people. And the Trump campaign claims this issue, last Monday when this broke, is what started to turn things, they say, in their favor. So I think an issue involving the real lives of real people that plays into, even though a lot of the coverage has overstated the extent of the hikes, the extent of the problem, I think this may be the sleeper issue right now that Republicans ride through direct mail and digital, et cetera, to an advantage with a lot of voters.
Yeah, I disagree, and for a couple reasons. One, if there was a time when Obamacare was going to be a decisive issue, it should have been in 2012. We saw what happened there. It did not sink Barack Obama in 2012. The law was more unpopular than it is now.
That's because Mitt Romney was a horrible messenger on health care.
Well, you could argue, and that gets to our next question. Is Donald Trump a great messenger on this? I don't think so. In addition to the fact that he has no alternative, I'll just point out that he was just lying kind of gratuitously in that clip we showed where he said that Hillary Clinton wants to have the government take over all of health care in America. That's just blatantly false. He also, as I said, doesn't have an alternative. But the other thing that's true is that you're right. Obamacare is more unpopular than it is popular. More people dislike it than like it. But the numbers are, it's not that much more unpopular, which is to say the split between favorable and unfavorable is only a few points. And it's been really stable for now 2 or 3 years, the split. High 40s versus mid to low 40s on the unfav versus fav. And I just don't think that what has happened last week is going to radically change that to the point where it's really going to matter on election day.
Just let me be clear. I know we got to go, but let me be clear.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a silver bullet. I don't think it's going to achieve some huge game changer. All I'm saying is between Bill Clinton Inc. and WikiLeaks, the Comey comment, and health care, I think health care may be the one that, to the extent Trump is gaining, is helping him the most.
Okay. All right. I'll take that under advisement as your doctor. Up next, Russia and taxes, a Trump tale. We'll be right back. has been a truckload of unhappy headlines for Donald Trump just in the past 24 to 36 hours, and lucky us, they fit nicely into two categories. Some have to do with Donald Trump's finances. We will get to those in a moment. But first, Mother Russia. In the past 24 hours, we've read count them, four different reports examining potential ties between Trump world and what Mitt Romney likes to call our nation's biggest geopolitical foe. First, we got Mother Jones for the story that cites, quote, a veteran spy who specializes in Russian counterintelligence. That story says the FBI received investigation about the Russian government allegedly trying to co-opt and help Trump over the past 5 years. NBC News also ran a story that says federal authorities have been looking into former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort's business dealings in Russia, though not as a criminal matter. Meanwhile, Slate says that computer scientists have been looking into possible communication between a server belonging to Trump and two servers registered to a major Russian bank. But in the New York Times, with its own Soviet-inspired piece yesterday, they knocked down that theory, reporting that while the FBI has been looking into multiple leads involving Trump and Russia, including that server business, no evidence has emerged that links the GOP candidate or any of his inner circle directly to the Russian government. So, Mark, it's a mouthful that I just read. Some of these reports contradict each other. All have been denied. My questions to you are the following. Is there any there? And if so, will it matter in the outcome of this presidential race?
Well, there's no doubt that after this election, the press is going to have to do a lot of soul searching about its failure to pursue a lot of these Trump stories over the course of a year and a half. There's a lot of stories that didn't get enough coverage that should have gone from print to television. In this case, on this bundle of stories, I think Trump's praise of Putin, Trump's failure to put out his tax returns to disclose whether he's got dealings in Russia that he's denied, I think those are the big Russia stories that have some tangibility. This swirl of stories, I think, probably won't matter much. And based on what we know, I'm not sure any of them do. If some of them turned out to be true, they'd be a huge deal. But right. I don't think there's enough there right now to say that they are. Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with really almost everything you just said. It is one of the great outrages of this campaign, and there have been many of them, and I beat this drum for a long time, that Donald Trump did not put out his tax returns. And we were, as much as we called for it, we couldn't get any leverage on that. The world should have come to a halt. Yeah, well, you know, it would have been nice if it had. And the truth is that a big part of the reason why, when people say, well, why do you want to see the tax returns? Because we really want to know. Is Donald Trump in bed with Russia? Does he owe them money? What are the financial connections? Because of the fact that he has had such a strange, consistent fondness for Vladimir Putin. And given that the Russians, according to all the national security and intelligence agencies, are responsible for these hacks that have consumed so much of our time, trying to influence our election in this way, we should really know more about a lot of the things that these stories glance at, get at. There's some, as I said, some contradiction, but man, this is something that still feels really, really suspicious and hinky to me. Yeah. When Trump failed to denounce Putin when asked about his murdering of journalists, right, I really do think in a campaign filled with low points, that was really one of the low points. As somebody who claims the mantle of Ronald Reagan and wants to associate himself with Ronald Reagan, to have replied the way he did. So I think Trump's overall meta relationship and relationship with Russia is a big deal, should be a big deal. Yeah. But again, I don't know that any of these stories here, particularly in the context of the Comey thing, are going to break through. Right. I'll add to the low points that's a parallel thing to that thing you mentioned, which is the notion that we had a Republican nominee or a nominee for either party saying that that Vladimir Putin is a better, stronger leader, or at least a stronger leader than the President of the United States, Barack Obama, or any President of the United States. Yeah, outrageous thing. I'm really interested. I hope someone will look into this conflict between the New York Times and that Slate story, because if that Slate story is true, that's really damning. The notion of a server linked up directly to a Russian bank, that would really get us into some interesting territory, and I don't really understand how those two stories could come to such opposite conclusions on that front. Right. All right. Confusing. Here's something else a little bit confusing. Donald Trump's financial dealings, they are once again making news in various ways in this presidential race. There's another New York Times story out today. It describes documents that report to show that back in the early 90s, Trump used a sketchy tax avoidance maneuver around the time his Atlantic City casinos were filing for bankruptcy. The move would have saved Trump tens of millions of dollars in federal income tax, and the documents obtained, cited by the Times, purportedly show that even Trump's own lawyers called the gambit legally questionable. Two other stories along the same lines. The Washington Post had a story, one that came out amidst the Comey comment the other day from the great David Fahrenthold. It was a Fahrenthold classic. It raises more questions about Trump's charitable giving claims. The other Washington Post story is a Matea Gold Standard about Trump apparently refusing, or at least reevaluating, payment to his campaign pollster, Tony Fabrizio. So, John, same question as we asked about the Russia stuff. Is there any there on these financial stories, and will any of them matter in the last week?
Well, I think the New York Times piece is on the basis of how much it gets into this detail of another, it's now the second big New York Times piece that suggests that Donald Trump has played the tax system in a way that no normal human being could and has avoided paying taxes for many, many years. I think that story is as devastating, maybe more devastating than the first one, but suggested that he could have not paid taxes for many, many years. I think that look, Donald Trump's hiding his tax returns. We just talked about this in the last topic. He's hiding them for a reason. It seems to be circumstantially clear the reason he's hiding them and has been hiding them for the entire time is the fact that he hasn't paid basically any taxes for a really long time, and that he understands that the political damage from that would be huge, and that he's willing to take the damage of not being disclosive rather than taking the damage of what if it was all laid bare for people to see. I'm glad the Times has been on this story, and I think for some number of people in the country, this is the kind of thing that is disqualifying, or as disqualifying as anything else Trump has done.
Yep. I urge voters to read the Washington Post two stories as well as that Times story. They're all really interesting. They give you a fuller picture of Donald Trump. I don't think any of them, again, are going to be game changers here in the last week, but they're all important and good for them to continue to pursue investigative journalism all the way through. I will say again, for Republicans and others who don't like the fact that Donald Trump is the nominee, the people who did their opposition research for the other 16 candidates all need to wonder and ask themselves, how could they not have found this stuff?
Yeah. All right. When we come back, we'll take a swing through the polling jungle with our favorite Survey Monkey man right after this.
Welcome back to the Badger State. Election Day is a week away. We're keeping a close eye, of course, on all the polls, as are you. So is our next guest. Joining us now from Stanford, California is John Cohen. He's the Senior VP of survey research at SurveyMonkey, whose latest poll, along with NBC News, shows Clinton with a 6-point national lead in the four-way. We had him on 2 weeks ago when you had a rosy projection for Hillary Clinton. There was talk back then of her breaking 300 electoral votes, etc. All right, so we're 2 weeks later. We're one email bombshell later. How are things looking?
Well, as you said, last time we were talking about could she reach 400, actually, I think was the question at the time. And now we're talking about how she can solidify her path to 270. We were doing a 50-state tracking poll at SurveyMonkey, and in today's map that we released, she's at 262. So she really has to recover a little bit to get past the 270 and beyond to create a mandate.
So, John, is this the reason this is tightening? Is this being driven mainly by the Comey letter, or is this a natural tightening?
You know, we're doing a 7-day track, so we're 3.5 days, pre-Comey and 3.5 days, post. And so we don't yet know whether we're looking at noise or not. At the state level, we're talking about little small changes. She's, kind of a little ahead in some toss-up states that, if she gets them all, she'll be well into the 300s again. So we're going to kind of keep watching day by day as we tick into Election Day. But right now, the map certainly looks different. I think the main issue is the email issue is just a bad one for her. 83% of likely voters think it was inappropriate that she used a private email server when she was Secretary of State. So when the attention's on her, and with her historic unpopularity, she's more vulnerable. When, by the flip side, you talked about all the stories in your last segment about Donald Trump. When the focus is on him, he suffers because he also has, unfavorability ratings just as high as hers.
So, John, I'm here in Wisconsin where Trump and Pence are coming in just a little bit, and we saw him in Michigan yesterday, out in New Mexico. Is your sense that those states have moved at all and that the Trump campaign has some reasonable chance of winning one or more of them? Or is this out of desperation because they can't find 270 electoral votes in their older plan?
Yeah, we actually have had Wisconsin much closer than anyone else. I think, we have Clinton up just a single percentage point in Wisconsin in our data today. That's down from leaning in her direction just a few days ago. So again, we'll have to see over the coming days whether it's, truly in that toss-up category, if it moves more solidly back in Clinton's camp. But it's certainly vulnerable. And, the email issue and the focus on it kind of makes, the turnout in focus for the Clinton campaign. 15% of Clinton's own voters think the email issue and the FBI's reopening the case is a major issue to discuss, not simply a distraction.
So, John, I think the last time when we were talking about the 400 electoral vote question around Hillary Clinton, one of the ways we were talking about it was in the context of a bunch of expansion/reach states for Democrats: Utah, Arizona, Texas, Georgia. Are those now off the table for Hillary Clinton, or are some of those still in play?
Well, as of today, Texas is off the table, but Georgia and Arizona are still there. Of course, that's not the campaign's main focus now. It's in Wisconsin, as Mark mentioned. It's even in Michigan, where our data show that as a toss-up. And it's in some softening in Colorado and North Carolina, which she needs to shore up in the final days.
Can you just answer about Utah, too? I'm just interested in that one because it's such a weird race.
Yeah, so we actually have Trump up a few points over Clinton, and then a few points more over McMullen. But McMullen's clearly gained momentum over the coming weeks, but we're asking that, every day as we are everywhere else.
No.
John, take a moment and explain to people the methodology that SurveyMonkey uses.
Sure. So, the key to any good survey these days is a good random sample. And we have the luxury at SurveyMonkey of having 3 million respondents a day to a SurveyMonkey survey, not that I send out, but that are sent out by, friends that you may have, kind of to what to bring to a barbecue, what to bring to another party, or your employer, or, some company you buy something from. And what we're doing is doing random sampling on the back of those surveys and getting estimates, on a rolling basis. We've interviewed about 1 million people over the course of this campaign, and now we're doing daily in the states. It's a really unprecedented effort as far as polling goes. We're doing not only all 50 states, but we just published a little while ago, results in all 34 Senate races and all the gubernatorial contests as well. So it's a major effort, that we're sharing those learnings as well as the results on a daily basis.
So, John, in a phrase or two, how would you evaluate Donald Trump's chances of winning 270 electoral votes?
Still extraordinarily slim, but there's now uncertainty in the contest where there wasn't when I was last on the program.
Okay. John Cohen, the great John Cohen, thank you very much. You just heard about the numbers in this contest. When we come back, we're going to talk about the strategy right after this.
if and when Hillary is president, what do you think will be the female equivalent of "you weren't born in this country"?
That's an interesting question.
Thank you. I have a lot of those.
I think the equivalent will be she's tired, she's moody, she's being emotional.
There's just something about her.
There's something about her. When men are ambitious, it's just taken for granted. Well, of course they should be ambitious. When women are ambitious, why? That theme, I think, will continue throughout her presidency, and it's contributed to this notion that somehow she is hiding something.
That was President Obama on TBS's Full Frontal with Samantha Bee last night. Joining us now is Trump's senior advisor, A.J. Delgado, and former Congressman and Clinton supporter, Harold Ford Jr. Hi, guys. How are you?
With you both.
How's it going? What'd you think about that, Obama and Bee there?
He's always entertaining. She's a talented comedian, so it's always nice to have a sitting president comment with a little bit of humor on the election.
Yeah.
Fine with that.
So tell me about where you think the race is right now. You're here obviously representing the Trump campaign. What do you think? We've been talking about it all half of the show. Where do you think it is?
I think we could all agree it's tightening to Mr. Trump's favor. We saw a huge swing, that's an understatement, with the ABC poll, where we were down by, 13 points about a week ago, and now up 1. Rasmussen were tied, and in certain swing states, it's a dead heat. She's losing her lead in Virginia. This is not looking good for Hillary Clinton.
Harold, what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's no doubt the numbers have tightened. We remain confident in all the battlegrounds. I think there's a lot for Mr. Trump to overcome here in these last few days. Put aside this weekend story regarding Mr. Comey, the facts of the race don't change, and the positions that she's taken and that Mr. Trump has taken in the direction they want to take the country, none of that has changed. So if on Tuesday or Wednesday of last week you felt that Hillary Clinton was the best positioned to lead the country, to make us safer and stronger again and more prosperous, nothing has changed between now and last Wednesday that would cause any voter to say, I don't believe she's capable of doing that.
We just talked earlier about this in the show, Harold, about the kind of panoply of negative headlines, bad stories about Donald Trump, some related to Russia, some related to his taxes, some related to other financial matters. If you were running the Clinton campaign, which you're not, what would you want to focus on among those stories to drive the narrative over the course of the last 6 or 7 days?
I think that the fact that Mr. Trump refuses to release tax returns, the fact that Mr. Trump has had business dealings where he's had partners, old partners of his, say that I didn't feel like I was treated fairly by him. I would focus there if I were her, some on the negative part, but I would take this last few days to lay out where I want to take the country. I think the mandate that she's going to have is going to be predicated not only on making clear why Donald Trump is not fit to be president. I think that narrative is out there. No disrespect to AJ, but I think that narrative on our side has been put out there. I think for her to have a mandate when she's elected, she's got to remind people about her infrastructure spend. She's got to remind people about raising wages. She's got to remind middle-class families this is about empowering and re-empowering you through making health care more affordable, through making education more accessible, good education options. So I would get back to saying I'm ready to be president. I'm ready to manage world affairs on America's behalf and ready to grow this economy in a way to build on the successes of the last 8 years.
AJ, do you want to respond?
Got to disagree with that, Harold, with all due respect. No pun intended. I do think the last few days have changed things for voters. I think when we have hundreds of thousands of emails that have ended up on Anthony Weiner's laptop, a man of very dubious character, we have to ask from a national security standpoint, which is a top issue for nearly every American voter, how could this person then be elected to serve at the highest levels of office, at the highest levels of handling classified information? She's already shown herself inept at being able to do that, and this just proves it. And also, as far as the mandate, it's really Mr. Trump who for the past year has been traveling across the country, laying out specific plans, even plans on issues as detailed as combating the heroin epidemic we're facing in this country. I don't hear Hillary Clinton speaking about that, on jobs, on trade, on immigration, on border security. I remember reading one independent article that said Hillary Clinton's a great candidate, but a policy-free one. And I thought that was just such an astute observation. She always speaks in these vague platitudes about, well, raising wages and all these things she will promise, but is almost policy and specifics free.
You know,
it's odd.
You know, she's got about 800 pages of policy on her website compared to about 100 on yours.
And
right?
you judge it based on the website?
Well, she does have policies that are on the record. She's put them out.
You should check, speaking of her website, you should check.
In a fair amount of detail, which you guys have not really done.
Her immigration immigration policy on her website, John, is frightening to any American voter that's concerned about immigration and security at the border.
We can say a lot of things about Secretary Clinton, but I think one that's unfair thing to say is she's not been specific about policies over the course of her public life. In fact, I think she's probably been too specific at times and drawn voters to think that maybe she's not as exciting a candidate because that's where her focus has been. Again,
Obamacare, do you take credit then as she does for Obamacare, which has been proven to be a disaster this month?
Well, it hadn't been proven to be a disaster. It needs to be fixed.
The policy raises. Come on, Harold.
But she's indicated she's ready to fix part of it, and so is President Obama. But that's President Obama's the Affordable Care Act.
No, she said, let's be fair, she recently tweeted before they called it Obamacare, they called it Hillary Care. So it's on her. She owned it.
So if one of the differences between our campaigns is whether or not we're going to ensure that the 23 million Americans who have health insurance now as a result of the Affordable Care Act continues, and I'll take that. I'll embrace that. Does it need to be fixed going forward? Secretary Clinton is committed to doing that. Mark, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Here comes Mark.
That's okay. Harold, is there any way to look at the fact that Bill Clinton's going to Colorado, that Tim Kaine is here in Wisconsin, that the Clinton campaign is going up with paid media in those states and a couple others? Is there any way to read that except concern from the Clinton campaign that Trump may be threatening in these states?
We're near the end of a campaign, and I think that they understand that turnout and every vote matters. So I would hope, you could read what you may want to read into it, but I don't think there's any doubt the race has tightened. I think if you were to ask a lot of Clinton operatives and those very close to the campaign day to day if they were surprised by this, I think most would say no. There's no doubt there was surprise last week with the way Mr. Comey decided to inform Congress and voters as to what he was doing and the way in which he described it, so I don't deny that. But I don't think anyone should be surprised that our top operatives and our best campaign principals are out in the most competitive states. So I read it as we need to win those states, and we send our best people there.
Okay, AJ, I know you've been asked this before. I'm going to make one last try. Mr. Trump doesn't want to release his tax returns, he says, because he's under audit. Why can't he release for every year simply his income, his effective federal tax rate, and his charitable deduction amounts?
Because that's all intertwined with the audit. And Mark, with all due respect, again, I keep saying that phrase, really the only tax return that matters to the American voter at the end of the day is my own and those of my friends and families. It's only Donald Trump that has a plan to put more money back in our pockets, return those jobs we've lost, and create more jobs. I don't think this is a big issue for the American public. It is for the media that is intent on bringing down Mr. Trump with the silliness of the tax returns. We're too busy caring about our own tax returns to worry about that.
Releasing those numbers have nothing to do with the audit. I'd urge you to ask him to release those so people could have a little bit more information, as they have about every general election presidential candidate.
As an attorney myself, I can
why
tell
would
you
those have any implication for the
I would never
audit?
suggest somebody release this. And I can't believe a week into the election, we're discussing this rather than the 650,000 emails that ended up on Anthony Weiner's laptop, which is a huge national security concern for voters. Don't know why we're still on that topic.
We're discussing both. We got less than 30 seconds. Ask you each for a headline. What will the headline be for a newspaper the day after the election? Harold?
Clinton wins, and mandate is understood. Raise wages and empower the middle class.
AJ?
People's champion wins in a landslide. America wins.
Clinton wins again.
You heard one headline, right? You said per person. Typical Clinton cheat over here.
We just met too. Wow.
Right?
We just met. Wow.
She keeps saying, with all due respect, I don't think she knows what that phrase means, Harold.
Wow.
That's a little harsh. I think neither one of you guys should be in the headline writing business. AJ Delgado, Harold Ford Jr., thank you both for coming on. Coming up, we have Ralston Reports, the great John Ralston Reports next. And if you're watching this in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
back in Wisconsin in time for our very own customized Ralston Report. With us from Vegas, John Ralston, the editor of the eponymous Ralston Reports, a columnist at the Reno Gazette-Journal, and a contributing editor at the Politico. John, welcome. What is going on in the U.S. Senate race there for Harry Reid's seat, and how is that impacting potentially the presidential race?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess I have to tell you that I think this is the most amazing Senate race that I've covered. And you guys know I've covered every one since 1986. It's going to be a $100 million race, more outside spending than I've ever seen. And I really think it could go either way still. And it essentially has boiled down to Joe Heck, not versus Catherine Cortez Masto, but Joe Heck versus Harry Reid. Harry Reid has been all over this race, in the background on one side and in the foreground on the Republican side. And while the early voting numbers don't look good for the Republicans, remember what happened in 2012. Obama won the state by almost 7, and Dean Heller pulled out the Senate race by 12,000 votes.
So, John, is the fact that the Senate race is competitive, the kind of coalition the two Senate candidates are trying to put together, does that advantage either of the presidential candidates?
You know, it's interesting, Mark, because I think they're totally divorced from each other in many ways, and not just because Heck divorced himself from Trump, which initially caused him a lot of problems, even his campaign would admit, but doesn't really now. The coordinated campaign between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Reid Democratic machine has been so focused on getting out the Democratic base, which I think is going 90% for Clinton, 90% for Cortez Masto. And from what I understand, Heck so far is mirroring Trump, which is a real problem for him. The entire Heck strategy in this election is knowing they're going to lose early voting to hope to minimize that loss and then win on Election Day by 4 or maybe 5 points. Little margin for error there.
So, John, I want to step back and get a little bit more altitude on the discussion just on the presidential race in your state, okay? Somehow Nevada has become one of the key states for Donald Trump that he's going to have a path to get 270 electoral votes. If you looked at Barack Obama's victories in 2008 and 2012 and the demographic composition of your state, you wouldn't have thought that Nevada would be up there with places like Iowa and Ohio, much whiter states. You wouldn't have thought that would be one of the keys to Trump winning, and yet he's competitive there. So just explain to me why.
Well, it's a very good question, John, and I guess what I'd say about that, is he competitive here? I've always thought that the state leans toward Clinton for the reasons that you mentioned, the fact that the Hispanic vote is probably going to be above 20%. But I always go back to what Trump said on the night that he won the caucus here when he looked at the exit polling, and he was almost surprised, and he said what none of us would say aloud: look how I did among the poorly educated. I love the poorly educated. Nevada has a lot of poorly educated folks. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think that there's a path here for Trump unless there's a total implosion in the early voting numbers in the last 4 days. But they must have polling that shows that, because Trump was here and because they're continuing to campaign hard here with surrogates, including the great John Voight appearance tomorrow.
All right, you're looking forward to that, I'm sure. But the reality is not only are they spending time there, but the polling there has been kind of seesawed back and forth. It's kind of suggested Trump's been ahead in some polling there, and it's been tighter than you would have expected. So, again, what explains the fact that it's even in play? I mean, I would have thought that, given the demographic trends, that this state would have been put away for Hillary Clinton in the way that Colorado, for instance, seems to have been put away for her months ago.
Well, I think that's a reasonable assumption. And let's assume for a second the polls are right. And I'm not so sure that's a good assumption, because you guys and I have talked about polling in Nevada for years.
Yeah.
It is not good here. It's very difficult to poll here. But here's what's going on here, and you will get some sophisticated Democrats to acknowledge this. Hillary Clinton is not Barack Obama. There was real excitement, enthusiasm. The base got out enthusiastically to vote for Barack Obama here in 2008 and 2012. There is much more dragging out of homes, having to bus people, doing things they didn't do before. There's a lot more registration and GOTV groups on the ground here on the Democratic side than there ever have been before. And there's one other phenomenon that's going on here that's going on elsewhere in early early voting. Young African Americans are not getting out to vote in the numbers that they did in 2008 and 2012.
The great John Ralston, thank you. We'll check in with you again soon, I hope. Up next, a lot of the national media is gathered here in Eau Claire, Wisconsin tonight. We wrestled two of them to the ground and had them come join us. That after these words from our sponsors. Joining me here now in Eau Claire, where Donald Trump, Mike Pence hold a rally tonight. NBC News, Katie Tur, who's inside the event. And with me side by side here, Bloomberg reporter on the Trump beat, Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, one of the advantages you have, you see the guy every day. Yeah. Where do you think his head is at now in terms of, as his campaign expresses more confidence, his inner confidence that he's can win or will win?
Well, you know, ever since that FBI reopening of the investigation, I've noticed a shift on the trail, not only in the crowds, but also in the candidate himself. You know, just when that broke, we were all over the country in the past 3 days. And you've definitely seen a new energy. It's definitely been a shift, quite frankly, since the last time I was here and all of those accusations from all those women had come out.
Katie, I get why we see Trump and Pence together in Pennsylvania today, doing the Affordable Care Act event, because they really want to emphasize that message, and Pence has got some expertise there. But why are they together in Wisconsin as opposed to the norm of fanning out?
Well, what they needed to do in Philadelphia is find a way to get those suburban women to join Trump. And they felt like the best Republican ally they have right now is Governor Mike Pence. So who better to come out on stage and nail through these or hammer through these policy points? It is interesting that they are so laser focused right now on the Affordable Health Care Act. You know, Mark, you and I have been talking about how Donald Trump should have been hammering the WikiLeaks stuff a little bit more, but he kept straying from it. It seems like somebody finally got into his ear and is telling him to stay on these issues that will benefit him and potentially help him gain ground going through the election season or through the next week. But it is notable, Governor Pence was with him outside of Philadelphia. He's staying in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania, frankly, much more so than Wisconsin, is a must-win state. If they don't get Pennsylvania, it's hard to see what the path to 270 is. And right now they are struggling, especially among suburban women in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Yep. The Trump campaign tells us that Scott Walker will be here tonight, Reince Priebus, both obviously from Wisconsin. Who's been out traveling with him lately? How are they doing at getting the kind of Republican politician support on the trail that Clinton gets all the time from the Democrats?
Well, you're seeing people like Rudy Giuliani, and you're seeing people like Bobby Knight as well, who was with him today as well as yesterday. But you're also seeing some of his closest campaign advisors, like Jared Kushner, as well as Stephen Miller, his senior policy advisor. I would say on the issue of the Obamacare and the Affordable Health Care Act, if you talk to senior advisors, they almost view this as a secret weapon of sorts and a closing argument, because if you go to those suburbs, if you go outside of Philadelphia, if you go to some of these other battleground states, Obamacare is incredibly unpopular, particularly as these new reports of increasing premiums come up. And so I think that is they're trying to showcase perhaps a more substantive side of Donald Trump as he makes his closing argument.
Katie, we're all sort of braced to see if any more stuff breaks. Do you feel like the Trump campaign is still in the mode of hoping there's additional WikiLeaks disclosures, additional stuff maybe from the FBI, or do you think they're comfortable with the hand they have now?
Well, I think they're happy with the hand they have now. I'm not sure if comfortable is the right word, and I'm not sure that you could say anybody knows if anything else is going to break in these next 7 days. Certainly the FBI revival of that investigation came as a surprise to absolutely everybody, including House Republicans and Senate Republicans, as well as the Clinton campaign itself. So comfortable is also not a word that I would use, but I would say that they are hopeful going forward, that if they're able to focus on this FBI revival and looking into the emails again, also focus on the premiums rising in Obamacare and its unpopularity among the suburbs of Philadelphia, like Kevin was saying, but then also the rigged system and using the Donna Brazils, CNN, potentially giving questions to a CNN debate to Hillary Clinton, using that as a perfect example of their rigged system, the system being rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton over, say, someone like Bernie Sanders. They're able to not necessarily get more folks into their tent, but mostly make sure that Republicans out there who have been unsure of Donald Trump for the past 17 months come home to the Republican Party and vote the ticket all the way through. They need to find those moderates that they haven't been able to get, those that have been uncomfortable with Trump. But if they're able to say, hey, listen, Hillary Clinton is somebody, if she gets in office, could potentially face an indictment, they're hoping that that is going to convince those that are still the outliers to come in and say, you know what, I got to vote for Donald Trump. This is something that I need to do because I can't let Hillary Clinton get into office. That being said, it is a very high hurdle for him to overcome. Paul Ryan is not here in Wisconsin today. It's a pretty notable, with Donald Trump at least, a pretty notable snub. John Kasich the other day voted for John McCain, wrote him in on his ballot when he was voting in Ohio. So the gulf between Donald Trump and some more moderate Republicans, or some traditional Republicans, I should say, is still pretty vast, and it's something that not even disdain for Hillary Clinton can help bridge.
Katie Tur inside the event. We'll see you in there in a second. Kevin Cirilli here with me. Thank you both. We come back. Final words right after this.
All right, you got to head over to BloombergPolitics.com right now and read all about how the campaigns of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are lawyering up for the possibility of election overtime. Tomorrow, Mark and I will both be on the road. I'm going to Utah. It's going to be fun. We got something coming up here on Bloomberg Technology. It's going to be a blockbuster week in tech earnings. We'll be talking about that shortly here on Bloomberg Television. Until tomorrow, from me here in New York and Mark up in Wisconsin, we say to you, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's begin with a check of first word news. Donald Trump joined running mate Mike Pence in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania today and took aim at President Obama's signature legislative achievement, the Affordable Care Act.
I will ask Congress to convene a special session so we can repeal and replace. And it will be such an honor for me, for you, and for everybody in this country, because Obamacare has to be replaced.
In Dade City, Florida, Hillary Clinton was joined on the campaign trail by former Miss Universe Alicia Machado. Secretary Clinton reminded voters about the state's critical role in presidential politics.
Florida can decide who our next president is, which will affect the nation and the world.
Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi says it will take time to rebuild following Sunday's earthquake. He made his comments as he and his wife toured the affected region. South African President Jacob Zuma wants the country's high court to block a state watchdog report about allegations of undue government influence by a wealthy family. Critics have accused Zuma of presiding over a government tainted by corruption and political interference. From New York, I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology is next.
I'm Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, a busy Tuesday of tech earnings, and we're keeping score. First up,